Hi, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Advocacy Street podcast. As ever, I'm very happy to be joined by my brothers Seti
Hello, everyone.
and Osama.
Hello, everyone.
And today we have I'm really happy to have with us an old friend, Chris Gunness, who I think many might know from him from his days when he was the chief spokesperson for UNRWA, the UN relief agency that serves the Palestine refugees. For many years. I'm going to introduce him now in a minute, but what we're planning to do today is have hopefully a really interesting discussion with Chris and talk all of us about what's going on, obviously, in Gaza today, what's happening with the role of UNRWA, and then maybe have a broader discussion about the role of media in the West in particular, and then try to get to some other points of discussions that we can kind of link to some of our other episodes on international law, the kind of criminal courts that are taking place, and talk about the really interesting work that Chris is now doing in another context, which I'll introduce and we'll talk about towards the end. So just very briefly, Chris was born in the Crown Colony of Trinidad, but he grew up in London, and he's actually an Oxford graduate. Mainly, he was a BBC. He joined the BBC as a graduate trainee in 1982, and for 23 years he served in the BBC in all sorts of capacities as producer, studio manager, reporter, correspondent, anchor, and other roles. In 2005, when he left the BBC, he joined the UN, and in particular, he started his UN career at UNSCO, which is the UN Special Coordinator for the Middle East peace process, which in fact started after the Oslo Peace Accord, and we'll talk about what this is. And interestingly, and something I'd like to bring up later, is he was also a member of the UN mission that was mandated by the UN to try and halt the Lebanon war in 2006. So I will certainly ask him about this. In 2007, he was appointed the chief spokesperson and director of strategic communications for the UN Relief and Works Agency for the Palestine Refugees in the Near East, that's UNRWA. And he stayed there until 2019 when he left the UN and returned to London. I think many of us maybe that know Chris will have known him particularly from his role in as a spokesperson for UNRWA in Israel's 2014 invasion of Gaza. And we'll talk about this. And currently, Chris is the executive director of the Myanmar Accountability Project, which he founded in 2021, and which brings criminal prosecutions against war criminals in Myanmar, something that we're also going to be discussed perhaps in the context of Palestine. So with this in mind, welcome, Chris. We're really pleased to have you.
Yeah, it's a real pleasure to be here with you. Thank you so much for having me.
So, Chris, maybe we'd like to start our episodes with maybe a bit more of a background that you can give us about how you entered this world of the UN, of UNRWA, and sort of, through media, through the BBC. And it'd be interesting to try to, reflect on how you went through your media career, but then how things have changed. Because obviously, when we start talking about what's going on the BBC these days, at least as far as I'm concerned, I think many of us are concerned. It's something really starts to become, let's say, very frustrating, and so it'd be interesting to see how you see BBC having changed all these years. So please.
Yeah, Curry, thank you so much, and it's a real pleasure, I say, to be here. Although I sound posh, and I am both of Oxford and the BBC, I actually began my life in Trinidad in the West Indies. My grandfather was an indentured labourer, i.e. a slave, taken by the Brits from India to work on the plantations in Trinidad. And after the emancipation of indentured labourers, as they were called, my grandfather became a teacher, educated my father, who won an Ireland scholarship. He was a scholarship boy, and he came to university in England to study, where he met my mum, who was a working class girl, was the first member of her family to go to university. So from extremely humble background, my family is sort of scholarship people. So I I was sent to a very posh public school, as a public school in England, meaning a fee-paying private school. I was sent on a scholarship. I then ended up as a scholar in Oxford, and then I joined the BBC. But for me, because of my background, news was always about oppressed people in hot countries. And I basically see myself as a creature of the global south. And that's how I've approached really everything in terms of my values. My father, although he worked at the end of his life for a big, rich oil company, he basically spent every Saturday going to the impoverished fishing villages of the rural south of Trinidad. There wasn't even electrification, they were all very poor, distributing medicines and stuff. And as a child, I was taken out with him to those sorts of areas. So imprinted in my DNA, really from the earliest age, was the idea that what life was about was injustice, confronting injustice, and development and social justice and prosperity and all those sorts of things. And so that's how I arrived in the BBC in this sort of fast stream, graduate trainee, and I ended up in most of my sort of people from my training course went off to really kind of big TV programs or classical music and drama. And I chose to go to the World Service, which in those days was really like a cross between a broadcasting organization and an international aid organization. That's what its agenda was all about. This was pre-globalization. It's hard to imagine a world before, the captains of industry kind of took over our planet. But that was the world that sort of globalized. That was my idea of globalization, really. It was about how to promote values based really on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And so, that's how I came to the BBC. I very quickly found myself, my very first big foreign news assignment was as a cub reporter. There was nobody available over the summer. And the editors in Bush House, which is the home of the World Service, were getting indications of the first rumblings of revolution in Myanmar, in what was then Burma, actually. It changed its name to Myanmar later. So in Burma, from 1962, a man called General Ne Win had ruled the place with a very quirky, weird left-wing form of military rule, so the so-called Burmese way to socialism. And by 1988, the country was completely bankrupt. It had been the sort of breadbasket of Asia, and now it was declared bankrupt effectively. And the uprising, the rumblings of the uprising began. I got myself a tourist visa and went underground to Myanmar. And the day after I got there, the country burst into a revolution. So I, as a cub reporter on my first assignment, found myself reporting on actually one of the early Cold War revolutions. People think of the Cold War as ending in Europe, or the Cold War sort of taking place, as it were, in Europe with the fall of all the European dominoes. But actually, in 1986, you had Marcos falling in the Philippines. In 88, you had Myanmar falling, and then you had Tiananmen Square. So actually, the brave people of Asia rose up way before the people of Europe in pointing the way to how to end the Cold War, how to confront dictatorship. And I cut my teeth as a reporter watching the extraordinary revolutions, people power, and I really, it was a very salutary early lesson in what an organized people can do in confronting tyranny. And when I find myself in Palestine all these years later, I would often think back to the extraordinary courage and bravery of the students. It was a student-led revolution in Myanmar, and others, democratic politicians and others jumped on the bandwagon. But essentially, it was about young people on the street pointing the way forward. And I think that Palestine, in many ways, when you look at the people who are actually doing the real work of revolution in Palestine, it's not these long in the tooth, elderly statesman kind of folk. It's actually the incredibly entrepreneurial, brilliant sort of social entrepreneurs that are actually doing all the heavy lifting with the revolution. So, that was the background really that informed who I am and the values that I had, both as a reporter and then later as a UN official.
So, Chris, that's fascinating. And you begin your career in 1982 in the BBC, and of course, for us, as with Sari and Osama, 1982 for us obviously is the Israeli invasion of Beirut and of Lebanon, and siege of Beirut, I should say. And so, the memories of the BBC with people like, I think it was Jim Muir and others, reported from Bush House.
Who I'm still in touch with, by the way, he's
He's
in
still in
Beirut.
Beirut.
I messaged
Absolutely,
him
still in
regularly.
Beirut, and he was sort of the voice of BBC for us in Bush House, London. And in those days, at least my recollection as a kid was that BBC, had this authority, had this kind of authoritative, at the time as a kid, thinking anyway that it was what I would have assumed to have been relatively independent, relatively kind of strong editorial voices, and throughout that, So, do you think the BBC has changed? I mean, we're sort of skipping a little bit, but over your career at the BBC, and then fast forwarding even maybe to more recently, has it changed a lot? Was my memory or our memories as kids wrong, and BBC has always been quite pro government in a sense? How does this work?
I think you might be looking through rose-tinted spectacles to an extent. I mean, I think that essentially the BBC, it's changed in the sense that under Thatcher, for example, Mrs. Thatcher hated the BBC because it was critical of her, and like all of Thatcher's enemies, she went out to destroy it. So she introduced a thing called Producer's Choice, which is an internal market. So the BBC I joined was an organisation that just made programmes. And Mrs. Thatcher, in order to cut the BBC down to size, because of criticisms actually it had of her in her support for Ronald Reagan and his attack on Libya. I believe that was in 1986. But basically, she introduced this internal market, whereby there were people who made programs and people who bought programs. And she said that 40% of all the people making programs, i.e. the production base, had to be outside the BBC. So suddenly, in one bureaucratic wave of a pen, she had cut the BBC down by 60%, and so on and so forth. So there was definitely this attack. And actually, as a young reporter, and as someone very active editorial in the BBC, I remember thinking that the BBC was there to do battle with the government and to fight off these Thatcherite attacks. But essentially, I think the BBC has, through the years, maintained a certain editorial independence. And I think cutting to today, I think it's very easy for Palestinians, perhaps people in Lebanon, people in the Middle East, to say, oh, the BBC is an instrument of Western colonialism, of the victorious powers and all that kind of stuff. But I often used to say to my sort of Palestinian friends and colleagues, it's a little bit like, the Israelis do that. That's a classic Zionist thing of saying, oh, the BBC is anti-Semitic, it's committing blood libels. When you start in your public advocacy to start accusing a big international broadcaster of being antithetical to your cause, I think you're losing sight of the real target. The real target for Palestinians should be Israeli excesses, the violations of international law. And I think that Palestinians who are really serious about public advocacy should spend less time criticizing the vehicles, the BBC, and more time criticizing and attacking the real target, which is settler colonialism, which is, the Israelis, what they're doing to the Palestinians. Because believe me, there's nothing the Israelis want more than, instead of having a debate about the occupation, about the two cases at the ICJ, which we must talk about, instead of having conversation about these latest reports of sexual violence being used by the IDF in Gaza, they would much rather Chris Gunness came on your podcast and talked about how, the BBC is an instrument of Western colonialism, etc. I think there are arguments about the editorial lines that the BBC has taken on certain stories. I think the BBC is made up of individuals. I think they make thousands of editorial decisions every single day. I think some of those, and they're made by human beings, and those human beings have their own foibles, their own political views. Some will be wildly pro-Palestinian, some will be wildly anti-Palestinian, but there are checks and balances on every program that I've ever worked in at the BBC. Those checks and balances, largely speaking, are there. The more that the BBC has real pressures put on it financially by the government, cutbacks, fewer jobs, I think the more the weaknesses of those editorial decisions are exposed. But I don't think it's fair to say that the BBC is somehow inherently anti-Palestinian, anti-Arab, pro the West. And as I say, I think that is to play into the Israeli game, which is to have a conversation not about the state of Israel and its state practices, but to have this kind of distraction about, oh, the BBC, it's anti-Semitic or it's pro or it's anti-Arab and blah, blah. So to answer your question, I don't think it's changed a huge amount. I think that the structure of the BBC has changed, but I think in terms of its editorial policy and its independence from government policy, I think it's remained roughly the same. But I could understand why the young McDeeseys would listen to Jim Muir, who is a hero of mine journalistically, and in many other ways, he's a great, great man, would think, well, you know, when you do hear Jim these days on the BBC, he's often being hounded by, you know, an agenda that a presenter might have, and you might, you know, have remembered him being a bit let off the lead rather more in the earlier days. And maybe that has changed. But I think that's to do with the nature of news coverage, right? The sort of 2.5 minute slot on the TV, that is a creation of globalized television. And in the early days of the BBC, people had much more time to be expansive and discursive. And I think maybe that's what you're remembering from your early days of listening to Jim on the BBC.
Chris, that's. I mean, of course, I totally take your point. I mean, 100% that the focus should be the Israeli state and the crimes it's committing and the occupation and apartheid and now genocide in Gaza. There's no question about that. But it is nevertheless interesting. Now, not so much about the BBC, because here in the US, you know, yeah, we follow the BBC kind of, you know, at an oblique angle. But here, it's obviously it's CNN, the New York Times, you know, organizations like that dominate the, you know, not just they kind of function in a way in many cases, especially the New York Times, as a kind of, you know, ancillary of the Israeli state, to a very large extent. So I don't know about the BBC specifically, but I would say in general, I think it's been shown to be the case, and I've written about this in different places, that, you know, when newspaper editors or online website, it's not so much the TV news, but the online website of the BBC or CNN, you know, when they're constructing headlines, for example, they're very, very careful in the forms of grammar and syntax that they use, the word choices they use, the emotive language they do or don't use, to say, you know, for example, I was just writing about this earlier today, you know, bomb kills dozens in refugee camp in Gaza. It's like, well, where did the bomb come from? It's not Israel kills, you know, dozens of people in Gaza. Like this, but those kinds of editorial choices are always, you know, they're very interesting to talk about. And I'm just wondering to what extent you have, not necessarily in terms of the BBC, but in terms of how you've seen those sorts of syntax and word choice arguments being played out. And then secondly, we can come back to this in a second, but I'm sure you're following the story about the New York Times and its rape allegation story that's now completely kind of breaking down. If we could work through that would be, I think, interesting to do as well. So those two kinds of questions for you there.
Yeah, right. It's a really, really good question. And I've sort of seen this from the inside. So in 2014, just to make this real and relate to my lived experience, there were 7 incidents when the Israelis hit UNRWA schools. It was a much smaller scale conflict, even though it was appalling. And on every single occasion, journalists would phone me up and say, Mark Regev just told us there were militants inside your schools and that's why they had to hit it. Now, there was a war raging. UNRWA's a humanitarian organization. We don't have military surveillance technology that the IDF has. So, you know, at the appropriate time when we could get staff to these installations, mainly schools that were hit, we interviewed all the senior staff who were there. And there was a board of inquiry after the 2014 war. And in pretty much every single case, it was shown that there were no militants in the schools. There may have been near, but UNRWA is responsible for what happens inside these installations, not what happens on the streets of Gaza, and that's a matter of the UNRWA mandate. So Mark Regev was literally telling lies about UNRWA in order to justify a huge violation of international humanitarian law. You know, they were dropping huge, great bombs on UNRWA installations. And by the way, the IDF had the precise GPS coordinates of every single UNRWA installation, so they knew exactly what they were hitting. And what Mark Regev did then, and I think he still does now, is bully people. And that's a classic Israeli tactic, right? To bully both the UN, because the United Nations pays for most of UNRWA's budget. So anything I said would get scrutinized, there were Israeli journalists and others who would have WhatsApp groups or the equivalent in those days, where anything I said was sent to people, staffers on the Appropriations Committee in DC, and they would instantly kind of contact the main donors, contact my boss. Literally in the click of a couple of fingers on a mobile phone, and suddenly Chris Gunness was being assailed by the main donors. So a lot of bullying took place, and a lot of lying took place, to be perfectly frank. And I have clear proof of that. I'm very clear about what used to happen. So there is that strategy. The other thing that Israel has done very cleverly, and I wish the bloody Palestinians would, incidentally, is to set up proxy organizations, clearly with government money. So just to come back to today, from 2014 to now, there's been a development of organizations. Let me give you an example. UN Watch. I know that various journalists are trying to investigate who funds UN Watch, and it's very, very opaque. And there are suggestions, and there are only suggestions, I have no proof, that obviously money close to Israeli far-right organizations and others have funded UN Watch. There's another organization called Impact SE, which claims to be an organization promoting good curricula, so neutrality in curricula around the Middle East. I can tell you that when UN Watch was first set up, it spent most of its time attacking either UNRWA or people, organizations which it perceived to be anti-Israel. And after it got accused a lot of being basically a plant organization for Israel, settler colonialism, for far-right Zionist groups or whatever, it sort of made a policy decision one day to change. And suddenly on its website, you've got stuff calling for observation of, proper human rights observation in, sub-Saharan Africa and wherever else. And it sort of morphed from being what was patently, clearly an organization doing, following the political agenda of Israel into something pretending to be much more balanced and reasonable. But cut to, for example, in 2019, UN Watch and Impact SE launched this huge attack on UNRWA's curriculum. And when our education department in Jordan, there's a huge education department in HQ Amman, as they call it, they discovered they'd got the wrong curriculum. That's how authoritative this organization is. On another occasion, they launched this big attack on what they thought was the PA curriculum. So since Oslo, UNRWA has taught the Palestinian Authority curriculum in both Gaza and the West Bank. So UN Watch or Impact SE launched this big attack on the PA curriculum. And when we looked into it, we discovered they were actually attacking the Jordanian and the Egyptian curriculum. So they got the wrong curriculum. And then, on a number of other occasions, they'd make accusations against staff members. When we looked into it, it was former staff members or it wasn't staff members. And frankly, again, this becomes a conversation not about Israel dropping bombs on UNRWA schools and killing displaced people who've taken refuge there. It becomes a debate about UN Watch and the rubbish they put out about UNRWA, and that's part of their tactic, right? That's what they want. Even if they're telling lies, that's fine by them, because then it becomes a debate about, are they liars? So to continue your question, what has happened is the New York Times are now very much part of an echo chamber, and they are a very willing part of that echo chamber. And in that echo chamber, you've got groups like UN Watch and Impact SE and NGO Monitor and a load of others, institutes, in Tel Aviv, which are clearly, ex IDF, intelligence, Mossad, Shin Bet, God knows what. But they sort of quote each other as independent, authoritative think tanks. And slowly this information kind of takes hold and takes on a life of its own. And they self-aggrandize. So UN Watch and Impact SE, about a month ago, were in Capitol Hill doing a huge briefing. Was it in the Senate? It was somewhere, in the House of Representatives. They, of course, didn't ask UNRWA. There was no question of having a balancing voice. I would willingly have gone to DC and defended UNRWA in front of all these people and exposed their lies. But of course, that's precisely why they wouldn't invite me. And suddenly, these sort of phony, fake, pretend organizations outside, allegedly independent, are now being asked to go and brief senators while they make a decision about should they totally defund UNRWA. And, in a way, I take my hat off to them. As someone who's done public advocacy for many years, what an achievement. A bunch of mendacious people who lack any authority have ended up, briefing the most powerful government in the world. And guess what? That's led to the defunding of UNRWA in line with the far-right political agenda of the most fascistic government in the history of the State of Israel. I mean, if I was writing the kind of, strategy for those organizations, that would be the key objective. And guess what? They've just achieved it. So hats off to them. But the world and the world has been lied to, and the New York Times has quite clearly been part of all of that. So when they splashed, the day after, the 26th of January, you had the provisional rulings measures in the ICJ. So the International Court of Justice rules that Israel is guilty of a plausible genocide, has to report back on these various measures, stop the killing, abide by IHL, allow in international aid, stop inciting genocide. All these rules, were handed down to Israel. The next day, the New York Times splashes with a story that 12 UNRWA staff members were allegedly involved in the massacres on the 7th of October. And, what was interesting is that the head of UNRWA got called to a meeting in Tel Aviv. And he's on record as saying, I'm not, not betraying the family secrets. He was a junior member, a relatively junior member, the deputy head of the International Organizations Department in the Israeli MFA, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, just said, we accuse these 12 staff members. UNRWA was not given any actual evidence. So to this day, neither the Israelis nor any of these donors who've defunded have actually handed over an intelligence dossier to UNRWA, and yet the New York Times splashed it across the front pages. And of course, everyone believed the story. It was on the front page of the New York Times. UNRWA had sacked all these workers because they thought that if they took proactive, robust action, that would stop the donors defunding. That did not happen. So, and as you say, now what you're having is it's all being traced back to a specific website. There's a particular reporter in Israel Channel 13. UNRWA's actually written to this reporter and said, either cease and desist or present the evidence. Neither of those things have happened. And although it's the classic thing, everyone believes the splash story, and then the denials are much less of an interesting story, and everyone no one notices those. It's classic. But again, I take my hat off to them. But why does anyone buy the New York Times or believe a word it says or read it? I just don't get it. On Israel-Palestine, it's just an instrument of secular colonialism, and it's quite patently so. And now you've got stories of people who've been in the IDF, who have actually worked for working on the New York Times. Even when I was there, Ethan Bronner and various other of their reporters, he had a son that was active. I don't know about actively in Gaza killing people, but I think I'm right in saying that, he had a son who wrote about this, I think, who was actually in the IDF. Well, little wonder that they, when did they last appoint a Palestinian to be their Jerusalem correspondent? I don't know. How many Arabs are there at New York Times? I don't know the answer, but certainly I tend to think on Israel. On Israel-Palestine, it's all a bunch of Jewish reporters, many whom have links to the IDF. But I think on the rest of the world, the New York Times is often quite sound. But I just don't bother to read any of it because I just think, if they can't get a story like this right that I really care about, then, the New York Times is a toe rag as far as I'm concerned, and I don't bother to read it.
So, Chris, I'd like to push back, if I may, on this point that you raised, because you said two different things, and what you're saying about these journalistic enterprises, these so-called sort of shadow organizations that come up and then accuse and then are given credibility. Sadi and I and Karim, as academics, we face, especially here in the US, you face similar kinds of organizations that claim to be objective, claim to be, or institutes like the Washington Institute for Near East, which is basically WINEP, which is essentially sort of an AIPAC or was an AIPAC or has relations to AIPAC and so on. So we're familiar with these kinds of attacks that then create an agenda and a frame. But so I'm trying to figure out and understand when you say that that Palestinians should do this. I know you mean tongue in cheek.
I'm being very contradictory.
No, I understand. But let me finish, if I may. Just in terms of the BBC, Well, the pushback on the BBC is that you were saying that you're describing on the one hand an extraordinary structural Orientalist sort of bias that's inherently built into this echo chamber that excludes certain voices, includes other voices, and as Sadi said, the passive voice gets used at certain points, active voice in other instances. Why do you say to us that the BBC is, on the one hand, you describe the New York Times as essentially a front for Israeli settler colonialism on Palestine, but you say, but the BBC is not. Why should our listeners and viewers, I mean, maybe if you could just explain a little bit more why we should give the BBC a pass, more of a pass, given how the coverage is documented, that the coverage has been extraordinarily tendentious on so many occasions with the BBC. Just allow you that opportunity to tell
Yeah,
us, because I understand the point of it,
you're
the New
quite.
York
It's a
Times.
very good. It's a very good question, and your point is very well made and very well taken. My answer is, I think that whereas I think that everybody in the Western media, to some extent, are guilty of this, I think the BBC is less guilty. So I don't think the BBC should be given a pass, and you're misquoting me if you think I said that, because I certainly didn't. I think the BBC should be put under the same editorial scrutiny, and by the way, is regularly in both internal and external review, because unlike the New York Times, the BBC is funded by the license fee. So there's this kind of unofficial taxation in the UK. If you own a TV, you have to pay a license. And that essentially, bar some very dwindling funds from the Foreign Office, that is how the BBC is funded. So it's publicly accountable in a way which the New York Times absolutely is not. So that is one qualitative difference between the BBC and the rest. And I think that you're right. I think the BBC is I think it's much more balanced in the way that it deals with Israel-Palestine, independent of that whole funding structure. For example, they employ Palestinians in their Ramallah office. I'm not aware of how many. I'm not even aware that the New York Times has a Ramallah office. The BBC for many years had a West Bank correspondent. Lise Doucette, actually, my old friend Lise Doucette, she was the BBC's West Bank correspondent. Stephen Sackur, his aunt, late departed, amazing woman, I think I'm right in saying, is Rosemary Hollis. You guys as academics will know of the great late Rosemary Hollis, and her position on all of this stuff is very well known. I'm not saying that Stephen necessarily took his aunt's position, but if you're going to make ad hominem arguments, as I kind of am, like, do they have a Ramallah office? Who's in it? Do they employ Arabs? Then we can ask that same question of the BBC. And I think you could probably empirically verify that there's been a much greater openness by the BBC to have Arabs covering Arab affairs than the New York Times having Arabs covering Arab affairs. So I think that is also the case. So what I'm saying, Osama, and answer your question is, you're right. I think that there's an echo chamber. The BBC listens to the echo chamber, but I think it has more checks and balances, A, and B, historically, I think it's much more open to having Arabs and Palestinians being part of that editorial process than, say, the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal or, whoever else. On the question you ask about, well, if you're saying it's all wrong and there's an echo chamber and it's an evil system, then why are you encouraging the Palestinians to do it? I'm saying that the Palestinians should also organize better. I mean, imagine a world in which there was a Palestinian AIPAC. Are you three brothers telling me you would be against that?
Palestinian AIPAC, 100%. 100% I'd be against that. That would be a catastrophe. Honestly, that would be the end of our moral and ethical sort of purpose.
But it might be victory in terms of the court of public opinion. Would that be such a bad thing?
Yeah, but Chris, but that's interesting. So part of what that's raising, actually, it's a really interesting question, I think. But so part of what it raises, I mean, you're right that the Israelis have all of these incredible organizations, that do all this kind of work. You're saying in the UN sphere, in the media sphere, we can tell you also in the academic sphere, policing our campuses and regulating our speech and pursuing law. I mean, all this stuff, right? But here's the thing: in a way, the Israelis need those organizations. They need the AIPACs. They need the campus watches. They need the UN. They need all these things because they're ultimately they are engaged in a war against, not just against the Palestinians, but against the truth. They're fighting reality itself. I mean, they're trying to turn reality on its head and turn it into something that it isn't. And so they have to work a lot harder at that. And I've always said that that's one of our strengths, that we just have to tell the truth. It's a lot easier to tell the truth than to do the kinds of,
Okay, so
the sorts of things.
so let me rephrase my question to Osama. Imagine if there was a Palestinian AIPAC dedicated to winning victory by truth-telling. Would it be against that? I'm not saying that. Obviously, it would be morally corrupting for the whole Palestinian cause if there are a bunch of lies in Washington, right? Whose aim was to sort of subvert and corrupt the system. But imagine if there were some honest Palestinian public advocates who had a hold over the political institutions based on truth-telling, which linked the decision-making in Washington with the Palestinian street. Imagine that world, guys, because I think that would be a world I want to live in, because I think that would promote a huge amount of social justice in the Middle East and elsewhere, right? So I think I'm saying play them at their game, but play them at an honest game. And by being honest, beat them at that game and be better than them. And of course, you're right, Osama, it would be hugely morally corrupting of the whole Palestinian cause if there were a bunch of corrupt lies in Washington informing the debate. But imagine if they weren't corrupt lies. Imagine if they were honest people reflecting the views of the Palestinian street. I mean, who would not want that?
No, obviously, I agree on that point, and I think we're all in agreement on that point. It's just more, Chris.
So in other words, it's not the system I'm against. I'm against how the system is, the substance of that system, and if it could be a system that pervade values of justice and accountability and truth, I don't have how anyone can have an objection to that.
Chris, let me jump in here. I mean, I think what Sally was saying is interesting, and what I think we're all trying to say, and of course, I'm sure you agree with us, which is that from the Palestinian side, all that we as viewers, forget critics or professors or anything else, just as viewers, all that we ask for is for the reporters to do their jobs, and for the companies, the whether it's BBC or CNN or whoever it is, to simply report what they see. That's it, no more, no less, because the reporting, the act of reporting in a truthful sense, which is what they keep claiming they're doing, simply conveys the message, which is clear, which then goes to public opinion, which then you don't need 100 mediators to kind of do it. The way the Israelis have, as you're saying, all these groups, professional groups, hugely funded across the world, or at least across the West, whether it's on the NGOs or the UN or all these kinds of things. And you get to the point where some low-level liar, really, comes in and says, for example, let's go back to the UNRWA question. Come and say there's 5, 10, 15, whatever they are, who we say are work for Hamas or were involved in the October 7 attack or whatever it is, and suddenly before you know it, the Commissioner General Lazzarini had to come out and say, well, I've already fired these people. We got the names. Unless, please correct me if I'm wrong. We've had to fire these people before we launch into an investigation, before anybody does anything. And as it turns out,
he said reverse due process.
It's reverse due process, but I mean, clearly, sort of Lazzarini is a good guy, and he tries within. And this is what I want to get some insight from Chris. And if you can go back to the 2014 war and to all the other experiences, and sort of if you are advising or you're the strategic kind of media strategic advisor with Lazzarini today, and you get this report, and you get it, you sort of leak that these guys are going to kind of say something that's basically they're lying, and they're going to release it. What do you do? How do you get that message? And is it correct within the context of now, not some ideal thing, for him to have gotten ahead of it, fired everybody, gone and said, listen, we have nothing to do with this. If something happens, we're going to investigate, but leave us alone. Is that not, since we know how the Israelis operate, and they've been operating, and you said in 2014, they were operating like this at a smaller scale because everything was smaller now retroactively. But this was true before 2014. It was true, ever since I can remember. So this is the way the Israeli works. This is how the Western media picks it up. And this is how the Western officials end up dealing with this thing. So how should UNRWA deal with these situations? Should they remain always on the defensive, knowing that they're going to get screwed, knowing they're going to get defunded, knowing that they're going to get attacked in Western press, whatever they do? So why not stick to the heart, say, you do the investigation, and when you guys do the investigation, if you find that there's somebody there, then we'll deal with it, just like anything else. Why be defensive?
Yeah. I mean, to be clear, Karim, I'm not Philippe Lazzarini's spokesperson now, and I know that if I'd been in UNRWA at the time, I'd been asked, I would have said that the defensive line and the acceptance of the guilty narrative would have been a strategic mistake. And I would have argued that UNRWA has a process in place, agreed with all the major donors. And, UNRWA is the most audited organization in the UN's history, right? So, there have been the GAO, the General Auditor's Office of the United States, in 2019, I think it was, came and did a root and branch turning over of UNRWA, including its curriculum, including all these neutrality processes. And guess what? They carried on funding UNRWA to the tune of $350 million a year. So if I had been in UNRWA, now, and it's easy, what you said in America, Monday morning quarterbacking and all that stuff. I mean, it's easy to have, perfect vision with hindsight. I think, though, I would have said we have a process that's worked for a long, long time to the satisfaction of all our major donors. And that policy is basically when there is credible information, and I wonder how credible even these allegations were, but where there's credible information, UNRWA will always investigate, and where wrongdoing is found, disciplinary action is always taken up to and including dismissal. And that is not just the line which I've trotted out like an UNRWA spokesperson, it's the truth. That's the system which we, UNRWA, had agreed with our major donors to their satisfaction for decades. And UNRWA, under American pressure, has been forced to do all of this neutrality work, training teachers. There's an inspection system called the Operation Support Officers who go around all the schools and make sure there's no, graffiti which is perceived to be revolutionary or anti-Semitic or whatever. Palestinians see it as UNRWA, pressured by the Americans and the Israelis, depriving them of the right to resist occupation, by the way. And I think there's a genuine argument to be advanced on that side. But in order to maintain the funding and to maintain its education for now 550,000 kids around the Middle East, UNRWA has had to take some tough decisions. And one of those decisions was to abide by the neutrality frameworks, which is agreed with all of the donors. The education stuff is in line with UNESCO. And actually, UNESCO has imposes on those educating children an obligation to reflect their history and culture. And again, like the neutrality thing, I wonder sometimes whether UNRWA has been pushed too far in the direction of actually not implementing those UNESCO standards in terms of teaching history, identity, all that kind of culture. But nonetheless, that is what UNRWA has. That's the compact, the global compact that UNRWA has effectively signed with its donors. The choice is to say goodbye to the donors, and look what's happened. The education of over 500,000 children is now at risk. UNRWA in Gaza alone does food distributions to 1.2 million children, 1.2 million people. Across the Middle East, UNRWA distributes food to over 2 million people. UNRWA's primary health clinics have 7 million patient visits a year. And those are people, you guys know Sabra Shatila, you know Ainul Hilwa, you guys know Nahr al-Barid, you guys know all those camps in Lebanon. It's a disgrace that in the 21st century, as a matter of political choice, we have chosen, including the Lebanese government, incidentally, to allow people to live in these disgusting conditions. And in those disgusting conditions, UNRWA is doing its human development work. Well, it has a choice. It can submit to these neutrality frameworks, or it can say goodbye to that human development work with these communities. And it's, UNRWA has made that choice. You can criticize it, but that's the devil, that's the compact, that's the decision it's had to make. And I hope that in laying out an anatomy of that decision, people will probably say, on balance, UNRWA has made the right decision. I know lots of Palestinians who don't agree with that. They tend to be middle-class, wealthy, armchair strategist type politicians, Palestinians who don't need the UNRWA food basket. And it's easy for sort of Palestinian intellectuals like us, like you guys, to say, well, we think that was not a good choice, blah, blah. But if you had children who needed an UNRWA education, if you had parents who needed that primary health work in the UNRWA clinics, if you had, relatives who needed the stuff that the RSS, the Relief and Social Services program, does in terms of supporting disabled, special needs people, blah, blah, I think you'd have a different opinion. And it's a really tough choice, but it's one that Philippe Lazzarini has chosen.
But can I push back on that point, Chris? I mean, it's certainly true that UNRWA is absolutely essential in this moment and has been essential for decades and decades, obviously. So the issue, nobody here is suggesting that UNRWA should be defunded at all. But the point is that when UNRWA makes a decision to basically, when Lazzarini says basically reverse due process, we're basically firing people without evidence. And, once the investigation happens in the future and they turn out to be almost certainly going to be innocent, and then we'll give them compensation. That's what he essentially said. But in the meantime, we're going to fire them to placate our donors, but the donors have cut aid because it's an entirely political game. Everyone knows that this was, as you said, this was timed exactly with the ICJ decision to basically send a very clear signal that this is a war on Palestinians. So again, I guess I'm not sure that people are saying that we should, that we can't criticize the UNRWA leadership, but how does the UNRWA leadership respond to the Palestinians who are in their staff? In other words, they're basically betraying, they're the very people who are working with them.
Sorry, can I just jump? Sorry, just to jump in, just to. We may end up disagreeing here among ourselves, which I think is fine. It's part of the point of the podcast in a way. But I think, I mean, I'm not in a position to second guess Lazzarini, but it seems like he was basically in a position of we have to choose the lesser of evils here, and basically if it means
his calculation.
I can understand his calculation anyway. Like we can save 2 million people. Or we can deal with these 12 people who, by the way, and the confessions came from torture that the Israelis use. So, I mean, like this, I have no faith whatsoever in the allegation as such. But I understand the position he was in having to make that decision under the circumstances he's making it. Just to be fair to him, I think.
No, but the point, I'm asking Chris a different question. I'm asking Chris, to what extent is UNRWA's leadership and spokespeople, to what extent are they attentive to the Palestinian staff whom they're working with, as opposed to constantly placating very powerful donors who are extraordinarily sort of hostile? I mean, as you can see, they cut aid without a shred of evidence.
Yeah. Osama, can I preface this answer by saying there is nothing the IDF and the Israelis want more than Chris Gunness to come on a podcast with the Makdisi brothers and criticize UNRWA and attack UNRWA's Commissioner General. Let me tell you that's part of what they're doing. And I'm not saying we shouldn't. I'm not saying these are not legitimate questions. And I'm not saying I'm not prepared to answer them, because I'm about to answer it. But I can tell you that, just as I was saying earlier, that part of what the Israeli-created echo chamber is about is distracting the conversation. So they want nothing more than Chris Gunness and the other people who champion UNRWA to get up publicly and start criticizing the UNRWA leadership. So, bear that in mind.
Chris, sorry, and I want you to answer this. But I think it's really important to clarify this point. I'm not sure. I certainly am not, and I'm sure Osama and Sadi are not. On the contrary, it's in UNRWA is absolutely essential and has the full support. There's no. This is not a question. I think maybe because I really want you to answer the question, but I think it's really important for us to make this point that we are not critiquing UNRWA in this way at all. On the contrary, and I can imagine the conditions, forget Lazzarini and the kind of political conditions that he has to live with, but the staff that are on the ground and the colleagues and people that have to deal with this thing is beyond imagination, right?
It's tough.
But I think what we're trying to get at here is not so much Lazzarini himself, but the idea that he feels compelled so quickly to have to respond because he probably doesn't feel that the UN people in New York will necessarily back him up in the way that politically they should be. So it's not so much about UNRWA, it's about the UN people in New York at the higher levels who should have more balls to kind of fight back and say unequivocally, no, you need to give us the investigation, you need to prove it, and we're not firing anybody or stopping anything until this is done. And for any donor that does anything to defund, this is something which will be investigated and something has to happen. And of course, that's not the real world. But it's really that. It's not UNRWA. I think it needs to be very, very clear. Sorry.
No, I'm not shying away from criticism of UNRWA either, because I think there's criticism to be leveled at UNRWA as well as the Secretary General. I mean, the Secretary General came out and said he was shocked, right? Well, the word shocked suggests you believe the evidence. So the Secretary General bought into the guilty narrative before he was presented with the evidence. And by the way, Antony Blinken is the US Secretary of State is on record as saying the evidence is very, very credible, but we've not been independently able to verify it. So it's very credible, except we haven't been able to verify it.
These are the people that saw the beheaded babies, literally, right? They're the ones who said, oh yeah, we've seen beheaded babies.
Right. So on the question, so yes, I think I think, Karim, you're quite right about, I think that New York could have been much more foursquare behind UNRWA in response to all of this. As far as UNRWA is concerned, let me tell you, the staff unions in UNRWA, I don't know how well you guys know this, the staff unions in UNRWA, in Lebanon field to some extent, but let me tell you, in the West Bank, the UNRWA staff unions can close the operation down, are incredibly powerful. And for example, the decision to withdraw UNRWA staff from northern Gaza when Israel said get out, that was hugely criticized inside the organization by both Palestinians and international staff members also. So, I mean, I think that there was quite rightly a lot of internal dissatisfaction with that decision. And as I say, I mean, I'm not going to attack Philippe Lazzarini. I think that he thought that by taking robust and decisive action, he would head off precisely the crisis that is now engulfing UNRWA. And I think you can perhaps glean from what I'm saying, my views on this. But I'm not going to go further because I'm not going to be drawn into attacking UNRWA. However, I think that a wider point must be made, and that is that all international assistance to anybody, whether it's the Palestinians or anyone, is inherently distorting. It distorts economically, it distorts politically, it distorts socially, it distorts all relationships. And the fact that UNRWA, since 1950, has been delivering these services to Palestinians makes it historically massively distorting. UNRWA is doing what the Palestinian government, if it existed, frankly, should be doing, right? So all of the distortions and things that we are now talking about, those all result from a system which in and of itself is inherently distorting.
No, Chris, I was just going to say, actually, on that point, wait, I want to just go back to what Karim said a few minutes ago, which is that none of the three of us, nobody here is attacking UNRWA at all. I mean, that's not what's going on here. But on the point you just made about the distortion, I agree, right? I mean, there's an economic history to this that we can talk about. There's economic theory. There's all kinds of things here. But specifically, you were just saying when I cut you off, I'm sorry, but what you were saying was that the Palestinian government should bear responsibility for feeding and educating and taking care. I think my brothers, I can't speak for them, but I would assume they're going to agree with what I'm about to say, which is that the bloody Israelis ought to be responsible. They're the ones who ought to be paying, not just for taking care of.
No, they should end the occupation.
It's exactly what I'm saying. Yes, it's their fault.
Yeah, right. So, but I mean, yes, no, in Gaza and in the West Bank, yeah, but I mean, the way to deal with this problem is to end the occupation. If you're going to start saying the Israelis are responsible for delivering education in the West Bank, trust me, my friend, you're going to get nowhere. And that is it's a correct argument. And it's an argument which should be made, and it's an argument which actually I listened to the proceedings in the ICJ today, and it's very clear. The occupation, both existentially and in the way that it's being imposed, is evil, it's wrong, and it must end. And all UN member states have an obligation to end it, right? But if we're talking big picture, yes, the occupation ending is simply a stepping stone on the road to Palestinians having their own government, having self-determination, right? So I'm making a much bigger point than the one that you're getting at, which is, of course, the Israelis, as the occupying power, are responsible. But the system needs to look well beyond that and to say the occupying power should not even be there. There shouldn't be an occupation. That should end. And at that point, there should be Palestinian self-determination and a government. And by the way, the last election was on the 30th of January, 2006. That's what the Palestinians need to be looking at, not in an ideal world, they shouldn't be focused on the occupation and getting rid of the occupation. Again, it's another one of these distractions. We're having a debate about whether Israel as the occupying power should be doing it. Well, of course it should be doing it. We shouldn't be talking about it. No one should disagree that the occupation is evil. What we should be talking about is what happens when the occupation ends, and how the Palestinians govern themselves at that point. It's not about UNRWA, it's not about the occupation, it should be about how Palestinians express their right to self-determination. That's ultimately what this is about.
100%. Sorry, Chris, can I just jump in here on this question of UNRWA? Chris, could you just explain to our listeners and viewers, because I think many of them may not know this, the history of UNRWA, very briefly. It was founded, of course, as an organization. I think Karim or Chris, is this the earliest UN organization to deal with the Palestinian refugees and the only one to deal with Palestine, separate from the UNHCR, correct?
Yeah. So before UNRWA, it was like the Quakers and a bunch of sort of small. So basically, the 48 war happens. 750,000 people are forced or flee from their homes. Those in the north of Palestine head into Lebanon. Those in the northeast go to Syria. Those in the south go to Gaza. Some from West Bank. And then essentially UNRWA, as its title suggests, does relief. So these newly created refugee populations need food, they need medicine, they need housing. And so these small NGOs, get on with it. And then when eventually it becomes clear that Israel is not going to grant them the right of return, everyone realizes they need something bigger. UNRWA is created by the General Assembly at the end of 1949, becomes operational in May 1950, and very quickly a relief organization doing humanitarian emergency work morphs into a human development organization because they realize that in these refugee camps, kids are going to need an education, they need primary health, and they need jobs. The parents need jobs, etc. So relief and so it's created, and then through time, as it becomes further entrenched that Israel will not allow them to go back to their homes, UNRWA turns into this quasi-governmental organization. So it has these three core departments: education, health, relief, and social services. But then emergencies happen. 82 Beirut is invaded, and suddenly the refugee camps are overwhelmed, and UNRWA has to drop, or has to, as well as doing this core human development services, has to do all this emergency work, the war in Gaza right now, the genocide, dealing with the impact of all that. That's a typical example of the relief and emergency work that UNRWA has to do side by side with all this mainstream stuff. And that dynamic between the mainstream work and this emergency work has really defined UNRWA pretty much ever since. But believe me, to get back to what we were saying earlier, sorry, after you.
Just to follow up on that 2 points. So one is it fair to say that, and Kenny, maybe you want to jump in on this as well, is it fair to say that UNRWA, sort of the relief and works agency, is deliberately not political? In other words, the idea of Palestinian self-determination and the right of return are sort of, in a sense, not what UNRWA does. And in fact, is it an antithetical relationship, the political objectives of liberation versus just caring for bodies and humanitarian relief, as you said? That's one question. Second question, in the list of UNRWA donors who cut aid in this kind of really disgraceful way, deliberately timed with the ICHA decision, you look at the list and it's all Western countries and Japan and whatever. There are no Arab countries. Why is that? And does this go back to 1948 and the Nakba? And so why are the Arab countries not part of UNRWA?
Yeah. So, Osama, to answer your first question, that almost is like the narrative of the Likud right in Israel. It's UNRWA must just deliver food parcels and shut up on durable solutions, right? But that's not true. If you look at UNRWA's title, Relief and Works, it was set up to provide jobs, works, in the host governments, as it were, where they were. And that is a durable solution. Refugees classically have three choices: integration where you are, go back home, or resettlement in a third country. So in its earliest days, UNRWA was working on the first of those, resettlement where you are. So it's absolutely part of UNRWA's mandate to work for what they call, durable solutions, but basically dealing with people's refugee status. So, the Israeli far right, and actually Israel generally, and the Americans and some Europeans try to force UNRWA into this idea that there must be a hermetical distinction between the political and all the other human development and humanitarian work that UNRWA does. That's not the case. UNRWA's been forced by its donors into that position. But if UNRWA wanted to start having debates within Palestinian sort of the institutions it has, for example, UNRWA used to have, when I was there, an amazing school parliament where all 500,000 kids in UNRWA elected their own parliament. Well, it'd be quite interesting to have a huge, great sort of school parliament debate about, you wouldn't call it durable solutions for school kids, but some idea about what you think your dignified future is and where it lies and what is your relationship with with Palestine, etc. So UNRWA, if it wanted to, could have a discussion. And there are academics, Francesca Albanese, Lex Tackenberg, to people who've written about Palestinian and UNRWA. They feel very strongly, having studied it, that there is arguably within UNRWA's mandate, a mandate to look for durable solutions. And of course, this plays into the whole get rid of, destroy UNRWA. The narrative is, which is completely wrong, is that UNHCR, which is the other big UN agency that deals with refugees, they are mandated to resettle refugees in third countries, whereas UNRWA doesn't have a mandate. So let's close down UNRWA, hand all the Palestinians, 5.9 million of them, over to UNHCR, and they'll resettle them in Canada and God knows where else, and then Israel suddenly won't have to deal with the right of return. That is complete nonsense. First of all, UNHCR does have a mandate to do the three choices I outlined for refugees. And interestingly, their preferred remedy, as they call it for refugees, is the right of return. And the reason for that is that the right of return historically has produced more stable outcomes. That historically, when a refugee community is forced out because of a war, it actually produces a much more stable outcome if those refugees go back to their homes, make peace with their neighbors, learn to live with their neighbors, start trading with their neighbors, develop relationships with those neighbors, and move on with those neighbors. That's what UNHCR feels about the right of return. It is the preferred remedy, and UNHCR does all of them. So this narrative and this argument, get rid of UNRWA, hand the refugees over to UNHCR. And by the way, that's the whole thing about driving the Palestinians into Sinai. I'm sure there are those who want to phone up Filippo Grandi, my ex-boss, who was the Commissioner General of UNRWA, and say, can you go and do some tented cities in Sinai? And can UNHCR please go and take over from UNRWA with 2.3 million people in Gaza? And great, we've got rid of nearly a third of the Palestine refugee problem. We've handed it all over to UNHCR. That's what's going on. And that's where this whole debate about durable solutions, UNHCR, that's where it is all aimed at leading, and it's going to be resisted. And trust me, it's not going to happen because only the General Assembly, all 195 or whatever it is, member states, decide what UNRWA's mandate is. A far-right administration, a bunch of here today, gone tomorrow fascists in Israel will not determine what UNRWA's mandate is.
Chris, this is, I think you've really, this is exactly the main point that at least I was trying to get at, which is this idea of what's going on now, the trying to destroy UNRWA, which of course has been going on for a very, very long time, or to kind of end it, or to end its mandate, and to hand it over to UNHCR. They're trying to do this now, and if they somehow push the population into Egypt, then that's what they're going to try to push at. It's important to talk, when you were talking earlier about the question of durable solutions, and we did have Francesca Albanese on this podcast, in fact. It's not just the question of durable solution. It's that even at a different level, UNRWA, whether it's in the mandate or not, has come to stand for the international responsibility for the right of return. It's the only thing that's there that is guaranteed, that embodies this idea of right of return, which all Palestinians who were forced to leave have that right. No one can take that right away. But UNRWA itself is this institutional kind of international responsibility, which is why the Israelis go ballistic about UNRWA. More than the question of resettlement or not, it's this idea that it represents two Palestinians and four Palestinians, this notion of right of return. And so in their mind, if they can destroy UNRWA altogether, delegitimize it, make it turn into all Hamas, whatever, all these kinds of lies and nonsense, it also, at the same time, more importantly, just removes once and for all this idea of the right of return. And this is core to any kind of just settlement of the Palestine question.
Which is bullshit, by the way, which is complete bullshit. We all know that, right? I mean, these remain human beings with inalienable rights. And if UNRWA vanished tomorrow morning and UNHCR took them all over, they would remain human beings with both individual and collective rights, including the right of return. So even if that scenario came to pass, Karim, even if all that sort of happened, it is complete nonsense that at the wave of some bureaucratic pen urged on by a far-right administration in Israel, a bunch of human beings would be deprived of their inalienable rights. I mean, that's kind of fascist cuckoo land, and it's utter nonsense in terms of the law, in terms of morality, in terms of all philosophical systems that I've ever been part of. So we can that is just nonsense, and I think it's almost a waste of time talking about it because it's fascist sort of wet dreamland. It's not going to happen, and it should just be. I mean, it's just
Hold on. I just
silly.
want to follow up. Just because
just on the Arab states, if you guys can
one second,
get to it.
because this is important. I think you're absolutely right that it's of course that's what I was saying. And we had the previous guest, we had Salman Abu Sitta, who was literally talking about it on the map. So of course, each individual Palestinian who was expelled has the inherent right to return, and it's in their human right to do so.
And so do their children, and so do their children, by the way.
But my point is that that's not stopping the Israelis from fantasizing about this, and which is why this kind of you think, come on, this is some kind of who cares about a UN agency that's just taking care of people. The kind of vitriol that the Israelis have, and that certain segments in America have. What is But Chris, what's important here is, because you mentioned the question of the donors, and I know someone wants to get to the Arab countries now, but the donors themselves, which are mostly the Europeans, maybe Japan, a few, but sort of the Europeans in general, let's say, and America and the Europeans, this idea of the donors going, the defunding that happened because of a fake story that the Israelis planted in American media, which UNRWA, for whatever reason, felt like it had to respond to immediately by firing these people. The Secretary General had to also say, well, I'm starting an investigation. And frankly, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think he started an investigation in the, 200 UNRWA staff that have been killed now. I don't think there's an investigation or commission that has begun in that.
158 and probably,
No commission begins there, but they begin one for this from some low-level accusation by a bunch of liars that come out. Suddenly the UN has to do an investigation. As we're talking, they're doing an investigation. Fine. But the donors, they're now, I think, what are they, 15 countries or so, European countries, that immediately said, and obviously it was concerted. You mentioned the ICJ. It happened exactly when the ICJ case kind of was revealed. And so what is it now? So to go back to your role, and to the role of UNRWA, and the role of even at the level of strategic advisor, when you're dealing with the donors, no, you're not now, but I mean, like when one has to deal with the donors in this kind of way, how would you expect, or how should one advise, or is it impossible for UNRWA via the UN to push back at these donors who hold them, to the sword?
So, yeah.
Disgraceful.
Yeah.
I mean, I have to say, it's an utterly disgraceful response of the donors. Utterly disgraceful.
It's disgusting that the donors. No, it's completely scandalous. And I hope they get their comeuppance. And just as they're now saying there must be an investigation into UNRWA's neutrality, I think there should be an investigation into the donors' neutrality. I think British taxpayers have a right to know, what did Andrew Mitchell, Britain's development minister, know when he defunded? And on what basis did he decide to make a decision which will probably lead to starvation of hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of Palestinians? And I think that's a proper question, which you should try and get Andrew Mitchell onto this podcast and say to him, what did you know and when did you know? On what basis did you and all these other donors make a decision that will effectively lead to mass starvation? Right. So, yes, I agree with that entirely. But this question, I think, segues very neatly into what Osama is arguing about Arab donors. So what I'm hoping will happen is that there are two investigations, two reports. One is the OIOS, the Office of Internal Oversight, which, by the way, is pretty independent. I mean, the OIOS report saw effectively the dismissal and the resignation of Pierre Krembil, the previous Commissioner General, who was forced out of the agency effectively following a sort of financial, sexual, God knows what kind of scandal. And that report was done by OIOS, the Office of Internal Oversight in New York. So arguably it's quite independent of UNRWA. But then there's also the investigation headed by the former French minister. And my hope is that that will provide certain donors who want to refund. So the Americans, the Italians, the Canadians, the Austrians, I think are lost. I think they're not going to come back because they're so far right and crazy, and they're towing the Israeli far right agenda. But I think other defunders, like the Dutch, like the Germans, Europeans, and various others, I think my hope is that they will see the reports in effect as a ladder on which to climb down. They've made, I think, a stupid mistake. I think they acted hastily. I think they were wrong to buy into exactly what you said, Kareem. I mean, you put it very well, I think. A low-level kind of push by a bunch of whatevers, and it splashed on the New York Times. And I think those donors must realize what they've done. I mean, it was probably it was a political decision, but I think they're now realizing the implications of that political decision. And the fact is that many Palestinians in these countries are saying you took a decision which is leading to our brothers and sisters starving. So I think there will be pushback. So my hope, and I'm not saying this will happen, is that these two reports, which I think will find that the Israelis have absolutely no evidence, they're long on allegations, very short on evidence, that this will provide some kind of ladder on which these governments can climb down. But I hope UNRWA has learned these donors are not to be trusted. They are utterly treacherous, and they will abandon UNRWA and the Palestinians at the drop of a hat. I hope that the Arab world, and we need to talk more about unpacking that, and you guys will know much more about that than I do. I hope that the Arab donors will step up to the plate such that they can break this Western secular colonial stranglehold that these donors have, these 16 donors have on UNRWA. So, I mean, I was doing a calculation, I've been doing it sort of ever since this happened. OPEC's the last OPEC oil revenue sort of profit that I've seen is 2022. And I think I'm right in saying it was $888 billion. Well, 0.02% of that represents UNRWA's budget of 1.5 billion. That's UNRWA's budget goes up and down, but let's say 1.5 billion. So 0.02 of OPEC's oil profits from 2022 would get rid of UNRWA's budget problems overnight. The Saudis on themselves, for them it would 0.05%. So my fervent hope is that once this terrible, terrible existential crisis that UNRWA is going through ends, the Arab donors will realize that they have a historic opportunity to break the Western stranglehold over UNRWA by, as they call it in UNRWA, diversifying the donor base. So now, of course, there's other questions about the Abraham Accords, and part of the deal will be with the Americans. Don't you dare start funding UNRWA. That's the stuff which you guys know more about than I do. But there is an opportunity. Yeah, sorry.
Just because I think it's important, even for the listeners, and the idea behind, and the shift towards why aren't more Arab countries adding donors. The total UNRWA budget itself can be picked up not just by the Arabs, by anybody. It's not a huge amount of money in the grand scheme of things. The issue is that the donors originally, the reason that they're mostly from the West is that it was their responsibility, where the Arab countries were considered to be hosting the refugees.
That's such an old time. That's such a rubbish argument.
That's the original argument, is to say that
that's ancient history. That's ancient history. This idea that the West did the Holocaust, I don't buy it.
That what? Sorry, what did you say? What's the last point?
Well, the argument you're about to advance, admittedly you're doing it in inverted commas, is that the Germans did the Holocaust and drove the Jews into Palestine. That led to a huge displacement. And the West has since backed the state of Israel. Therefore, the West, America and Europe, need to pay for UNRWA because historically they're responsible. The counter-argument is to the Arab world. You now have people across the Middle East, the Houthis, Hezbollah and others, the Iranians, you name it, saying that the genocide that's taking place against the Palestinians in Gaza is a casus belli. It's the reason why we want to start destabilizing the Middle East, doing all these various attacks, blah, 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 blah. So to say that for Arabs to say it's just a Western problem is palpable nonsense. It's not even in their backyard, it's in their front garden. So it's their, I'm sorry, it's their responsibility. I think we're talking about two different things.
Also. No, I think these are two different issues. I think I'm just explaining the reason why the donors originally were all mostly Western countries is that they bore the responsibility for the Nakba itself with the Israelis. So the Israelis obviously bear the first responsibility, but the West, in the sense of trying to deal with the repercussions of what happened in Nakba, that's why they were the ones responsible. The Arabs were the ones who were dealing with the actual refugees across the neighbors, were dealing with it. And so therefore they were
they were host governments.
So I mean that was why historically the donors came from the West for the most part. Now the shift in this question is saying in this contemporary regional politics where you're asking, well, why isn't Saudi Arabia pay more? I think they pay now something, but why don't they pay more? Why doesn't the Emirates pay more, etc.? This is now precisely in the context of the Abraham Accords. I'm not sure it's going to help the Palestinians and the right of return in any way. if you're going out of the frying pan into the fire here, with in a kind of politics where the kinds of countries that will donate are part of the politics that are not necessarily for a just settlement to the Palestinian question, and certainly not for the right of return. So it's beyond the question of donors. What we have now is a set of European donors who have acted. Those that did. There are some countries that we need to say. I think Belgium, Spain, Ireland. There are a handful of countries that really kept that really need to be applauded for keeping a position under huge duress and pressure. They kept their position and maybe even added, it kind of increased the budget. But for those, I think you said 15 states, European states, and others that defunded UNRWA on this very flimsy kind of excuse, as I agree with it, these should be investigated in their own countries for what is the evidence they're using to cause, in the middle of when the ICJ is saying there's plausible evidence for genocide, and they're pulling out at precisely that moment the one main agency that is providing humanitarian support to these refugees.
And by the way, one of the provisional measures was to stop impeding the passage of humanitarian aid. So these donors, the very next day, are actually violating the ICJ's own provisional measures. So yes, I agree. But Karim, can I just say, I agree with you that to throw the Palestinians at the mercy of Arab states that historically have been quite antithetical to the Palestinian cause is clearly problematic. But there is a more immediate problem, which is dealing with starvation in Gaza, which is dealing with beyond that the education of these kids in these UNRWA schools. So yes, I mean, what you're saying, the broader context is pretty a grim outlook for the Palestinians. I agree, but there is a more immediate problem, which is funding UNRWA. And I can tell you, the Americans are not going to come back. They really are not, nor the Canadians, nor the Italians, nor the Austrians. So UNRWA has a huge problem. And although it's easy, I mean, if you had children who were in Gaza on the breadline, let me tell you, you would not be saying, let's have problems with Arab donors coming forward. We need the Arab donors because that's what's going to put food in Palestinians' mouths right now. And I'm afraid that's a horrible aspect of being a Palestinian. You are wholly dependent on the largesse of many countries who are antithetical to your own right to self-determination. That's part of Palestinian identity, frankly. That's how profoundly pessimistic and depressing, the whole thing is. But the immediate problem is how to stop UNRWA. And by the way, folks, there's a really important point to be made here. Even if I could wave my magic wand and UNRWA's financial problems all disappeared, today in the West Bank particularly, but also in Gaza, the Israelis are not giving permits to UNRWA staff. They are not giving the tax provisions which allow UNRWA to pay its staff. There are a whole load of bureaucratic encumbrances which they are now imposing. So even if tomorrow morning we in this podcast were to sort out all of UNRWA's financial problems, let me tell you, Israel could still shut down UNRWA by refusing to give it permission to operate. They're trying to close down the West Bank office, which is where the Jerusalem headquarters is. If that stuff starts to happen, forget about the financial crisis. Israel would have its way by simply bureaucratically breaking UNRWA down. And that's going on as we speak.
Yeah. No, Sadi, you had a question about the Israelis? Because I think we should wrap this.
Yeah, just a quick return to something we were talking about earlier. I mean, this has to do with this same topic in a way. All of us here think we all believe in the Palestinian right of self-determination. We all believe in the right of return. These are for all of us. These are inalienable rights that will never be yielded, and we all hope for Palestinians to achieve those rights, sooner rather than later. Obviously, that's part of what the three of us believe in. I'm sure you do too, Chris. But here's the thing: in the meantime, and it's not just in this particular episode. Historically, the Israelis have consistently, in places like Gaza, the EU, whoever will fund a power plant or something, the Israelis blow it up, and then the EU has to pay to fix it again. My question to you earlier was, and it has to do with the funding of UNRWA too. Why can't I know this may sound like a naive question, but nevertheless, bear with me. Pardon my naivete. Why can't the Israelis be made to pay the budget of UNRWA? I'm not saying they should provide the services, because of course they would poison the food if they had a chance to do so, right? But why can't they be encumbered with this thing? Why can't they be made to pay for the reparations for all the harm they've inflicted? Why can't they be made to pay for the reconstruction of Gaza, which has to be undertaken, not to forestall the right of return or Palestinian self-determination, but on the road to that self-determination, on the road to the right of return? Why is it they get to keep blowing things up and killing people, then they walk away, dust their hands off, and then somebody else has to come clean up the mess and pay for the damage that they keep inflicting? Why can't they be made? And I know you don't have the answer. I'm sure if you had a magic button,
I mean, the answer.
Yeah.
I mean, the answer is an answer of principle, which is clearly they should. Under the Fourth Geneva Convention, the occupying power has the obligation to provide schools, help, not blow up schools, not blow up hospitals, right? So the principled answer is that under international law, they obviously have an obligation to protect the Palestinians, to provide these services by, protect the right to education by providing schools, blah, blah. They are palpably doing the complete opposite. So the answer is yes, they should. But in the real world, I mean, look what's happening. So, but again, the answer to the Palestinians question and the whole Palestinian refugee question is a just and durable solution. One in my fantasy optimism world, one of the lessons of the 7th of October is that the myth in Israel that they can manage the Palestinian problem, as they call it, the myth that they can impose an apartheid system, they can arrest Palestinian children and torture them in the middle of the night, the myth that they can blow up schools, home demolitions, the myth that they can impose a blockade on Gaza, now do this, genocide, that's vanished. The myth that they didn't have to resolve the conflict as opposed to manage it. And on the Palestinian side, maybe in a painful, horrendous way, there's a realization that unless they take meaningful steps to granting Israel its security, and there's an irony, a group of people who've been deprived of an armed force, supplying the most militarized country in the Middle East with security. But that's, one of the ironies of what's happened. That maybe that realization on both sides will start edging, once this horrendous nightmare is over, towards the idea of a political accommodation of either side. Of course, it's going to be a massively asymmetric negotiation. We all know that. But maybe that one of the strange good things that might come out of all of this is this kind of mutual recognition, realization that Israel cannot have its security unless it gives Palestinians a state. Palestinians risk having another Gaza genocide going on unless they guarantee Israel some form of security. Talk about naivety. But anyway, that's maybe an optimistic note on which to conclude this conversation.
Chris, yes, no, yeah, I don't know about optimistic, but you had, just to wrap up, you had mentioned, I just wanted one last part, which is, you're working now for the Myanmar Accountability Project, and you founded that in 2021, and you can maybe tell us very quickly about it, and if you think it applies, or if there's something with all what's going on in the criminal proceedings and the courts, at the ICJ, the ICC, all these things, whether you think there's something that we can learn from what's going on in Gaza and Palestine generally, maybe just briefly at least.
I mean, in a totally non-patronizing way, I really do. So just quickly, the background, the Myanmar, because I mentioned earlier in this podcast that I found myself as a cover reporter covering the democratic uprising in Myanmar, in Burma, as it then was in 1988. When the coup happened, there was a coup in February 2021, where the opposition, I shouldn't call them the opposition, the democratic forces won an election, and as they were coming to Parliament to take up office and form a government, they were all arrested in the middle of the night, and the national uprising began. And everyone who'd been involved in Myanmar sat down and said, everyone was doing everything. There was development, there was human rights, there was this, that, and the other. And what didn't exist was an organization exclusively given over to criminal prosecutions against war criminals from the junta. So I went to a donor who gave us lots of money. I worked entirely pro bono, I hasten to add. And we set about using both domestic penal codes, so national jurisdictions, but to some extent the international criminal mechanisms to press charges against the junta. So under the principle of universal jurisdiction, many many penal codes actually enact. So when, for example, a state signs conventions on the rights of the child, it will enact international legislation, the provisions of the convention. And there are conventions against torture, conventions against forced disappearance, etc., etc. So MAP, my organization, Myanmar Accountability Project, uses this principle of universal jurisdiction that states, by virtue of having signed an international convention, have an obligation to bring to justice people, criminals, who have violated those conventions. So, for example, we have a torture case in Turkey because Turkey has signed UNCAT, the UN Convention Against Torture. We have a case in the Philippines where there's a long history, thanks to the Japanese occupation of the Philippines during the Second World War. There's a long history of bringing cases, litigations against people, even though the criminals are outside the jurisdiction. And many Palestinians have said to me, "Why don't we do this in Palestine?" And my answer is, "Yeah, why don't you? Why don't you?" And in fact, lawyers around the world are, particularly since the Gaza genocide, have been working precisely on ways of using national jurisdictions to bring prosecutions. Now, the easy counter-argument is to say, well, of course, no Israelis will ever go to the Philippines or wherever. That may be the case, but around all of our criminal litigations, we do a lot of advocacy. So we in MAP are concentrating on Southeast Asia, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, because that's where the Myanmar junta, are likely to go. The Security Council, the General Assembly, has kind of outsourced the diplomacy and the politics around Myanmar to the regional grouping, which is ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. So around all of our cases, we do a lot of advocacy. And I think the case in the ICJ and the ICC are very good examples. Whatever you think about what's happening in the ICJ, and I don't think Israel has even reported back as it was meant to do by the 23rd of this month. So 3 days ago, they were meant to report back on their the steps they were taking to implement provisional measures. I think they haven't. And I think many in Israel think it was a strategic blunder even to engage with the ICJ and accept the jurisdiction of the court. But they've signed the Genocide Convention. I guess they have no choice. But my point is that when Philippe Sands, the lawyer, the barrister for the Palestinian delegation at the ICJ, stood up a week ago, literally it was a week ago today, and said that the occupation in the way it's imposed and existentially the fact of the occupation, because it denies Palestinians' right to self-determination, is illegal. And he then went on to say, all member states in supporting Israel's occupation through trade, through diplomatic support, through financial arrangements, through cultural exchange, through any measures which support violations of what we hope will be the determination of the court, that is a violation, that is illegal. So we can now say the ICJ has backed the BDS movement, right? So that moves your advocacy and my advocacy to a different place. It's not a bunch, Israel will say, oh, it's a bunch of communists and lefties and terrorists and all the rest of it who are supporting the BDS movement. No, it's the highest judicial organ of the United Nations. So you can be very cynical. I could go on. I mean, you can be very cynical about work being done, litigations in national jurisdictions. You can say, oh, people from Myanmar will never go there. You can say at the ICJ, well, Israel will take no notice. That's fine. But what is happening is the state of Israel is being further delegitimized, being turned into a pariah state. And believe me, I mean, it may not happen in my lifetime. The Palestinian cause has become the Me Too movement, the Black Lives Matter. It has taken a different advocacy position. It's moved to a different level since the Gaza genocide. I think that young Americans will never again allow their administration, their government, whoever it is, to give Israel a blank check. And I think that's precisely because of this complete gear shift in the advocacy around Israel's treatment of the Palestinians. As I say, I don't necessarily think it'll happen in my own lifetime, but I think that accountability and justice are levers which we are pulling in relation to Myanmar. And I think Palestinians should pull it much, much, much more firmly in relation to the state of Israel, because around these legal processes, either through these international mechanisms at the ICJ and the ICC, which we've not talked about, there's an open investigation. Karim Khan could issue an arrest warrant tomorrow morning if he really wanted to, the prosecutor in The Hague at the ICC. That moves the whole debate, which does have a political consequence, to a completely different level. And I think perhaps not in my lifetime, but perhaps in your lifetimes and beyond, I think that is going to be a sea change which is on the way.
Well, Chris, you're a young man, so hopefully it will be in your lifetime. But this is a great place to end. So really wanted to thank you for all your work, your advocacy, and thanks so much for sharing your time with us now.
It's a real pleasure. It's great to be challenged and to be pushed by three very rigorous minds. So I'm very grateful for the chance to be put through my paces. I'm not sure how well I accounted for my views, but there you have it. But anyway, it's a great pleasure to see you all and to speak to you all. And Kareem, we've been in touch more than your other brothers, but it's great to reconnect with you. Thanks a million.
Thanks.
Thank you, Chris.
Thanks, Eddie and Shama.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Chris.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, guys. Well, I think that was great with Chris Gunness. And but before we wrap this up, I want to just to remind everybody to please rate, put hopefully a 5-star review for this, whether it's on the podcasts or on the YouTube, because it helps different viewers find us and find the show. So it'd be very, very helpful for us. And of course, send us any of your comments, any suggestions that you'd like to do. I'd also like to remind everybody that we've launched a Patreon part for this, for the Makdisi Street. You can go to patreon.com/Makdisi Street, or you can get the app for Patreon. And that way you can help defray some of the costs for the show. And there are different categories, it's easy to see. So any kind of help would be greatly appreciated. And yeah, so guys, I think this was a great ending to talk about from Chris and his way of his long experience at the BBC and then as the UNRWA spokesperson, and his kind of more recent experience in trying to bring those in kind of the criminal world to try. And so what do you guys think? What was the most interesting points?
Well, I think his the interesting points is his perspective of both being a journalist or being somebody in communications, both in the BBC and then, as you said, Kareem, as an UNRWA spokesperson, and the awareness of the level of framing and Orientalism and sort of the bias that's so inherent and endemic in the way Palestine and UNRWA are represented. But what I found interesting is how he kept saying, despite all this, UNRWA is a crucial organization, and that Palestinians, where I think I had some pushback against him, is this idea that the Palestinians should do what AIPAC does. I know what he meant, but it's more like, if Palestinians were like AIPAC, then we would have no moral or ethical cause. But he's saying we should be more effective, or Palestinians should be more effective in sending out their message. But that sort of begs the point, because Palestinians have been trying to for decades to get their message across. But there are structural limitations, right? I mean, this is what he seemed to, I don't know, at some level, not pay enough attention to. But I thought overall it was very fast. It was a great interview.
I thought that point about AIPAC was, as I said in the conversation itself, that the Israelis need AIPAC. They need the 33 constituent members of the Israel on Campus Coalition. They need Camera. They need Campus Watch. They need all these things and all of their blacklisting sites and all of the the mendacious things they do, because they're in a desperate war, not just against justice but against truth. And we could definitely use more organizations that that help with the media. There's the IMEU, the Institute for Middle East Understanding, which does some of that, a lot of that actually, I think. And then there's ADC has outreach, but there are, in terms of juggernauts, there is no Arab equivalent to AIPAC and all the rest. But the difference is also, I think, especially these days, when you look at who's advocating for the Palestinian cause, it's certainly not just Arabs. It's people all over the US at this point, all over the world. It's almost as though we don't need to cajole and it's not bribing, but you know how the American political system works. It's basically regulated and legalized bribery. In a way, we don't need to do that, because the people themselves will kind of, this is my hope anyway, will gradually shift the direction that political
Yeah,
discussions
and then
take.
Karim, what did you think about his point about UNRWA, the point that Arab states? I mean, maybe some historical sort of backdrop for the listeners and viewers, like the whole idea of UNRWA that was founded after the Nakba. And I thought, but correct me if I'm wrong, I thought it was all about the idea that it's Western states at the UN that helped to destroy Palestine through the partition of Palestine and the Nakba, the creation of the Nakba, or the conditions that led to the Nakba of 1948. And so the idea of the UNRWA was there to sort of pick up the pieces of what was left of Palestinian society outside in the West Bank, in Gaza, in Jordan, in Lebanon, in Syria, and so on and so forth. And so my question is, the Arab states were not involved because their whole point, am I right or wrong, Karim, that the Arab states were basically saying, this is not our problem. You destroyed this, you fix it. Can you shed some light on this?
No. I mean, I think the key point that we were talking about with Chris is precisely this: the reason that all these donors and this kind of scandal that we talked about, this scandal of these European and Western donors, or at least many of them, defunding based on this bogus story floated by some dimwit in the Israeli, one of these ministries, and that the Commissioner General Lazzarini had to very quickly dismiss those that were accused in the UNRWA staff of being part of Hamas, and
reverse due process, right?
Reverse due process, and the idea is, and the idea was not. I think Chris misunderstood a little bit. It wasn't so much that we were saying something about UNRWA or critiquing UNRWA. On the contrary, it's more that the structural notion that they felt that they had to so quickly dismiss these staff without doing a full investigation that starts, in New York onwards. I think that's something that shows the way in which UNRWA gets put into this situation where they're on the defensive immediately and have to do something that no other UN agencies do in this kind of instant turnaround. And I think I made the point that to this day, with 150 UNRWA staff that were killed by the Israelis, there's not been a commission or an investigation that's been launched yet. I'm sure presumably this will happen at some point, but it hasn't happened. And yet for this, somehow they've managed to launch an immediate investigation. I think this is very important. So the idea is that these donors are mostly Western donors because they bore the responsibility for what was happening post-Nakba, on the idea that eventually these Palestinians would have the right to return based on the General Assembly resolutions. Now, of course, this has been decades and decades, and things have changed over time, and UNRWA has expanded its thing. And we talked very interestingly about the idea of durable solutions that many argue UNRWA is actually involved in. And I was, I think, also making the point that UNRWA, symbolically and politically, whether it's in the mandate or not, symbolically and politically, represents the international commitment for the Palestinians to be able to return, so the right of return, which is why the Israelis and their American supporters are so adamant to want to destroy UNRWA, because it represents that, not just on the ground and the humanitarian support and this, but it's also a political and symbolically extremely, extremely important. So yes, the Arab countries, so the Arab countries were not involved originally as donors because the Arab world was, or at least the neighbors were there taking care of the actual refugees across in Lebanon, Jordan, these countries. And so the idea was that the West had to do the support in this way. Now, this has changed over these last few years, of course, and you do have increasing support from the Arab world, but it's dangerous. It's not as easy as it might have been before.
But my question is, when you say, and he said this word durable, it's the first time I hear this, so this is not my area of expertise, obviously, but the idea of durable solution, does that mean, because my understanding is that it was a relief and works agency that specifically depoliticized the refugees. That was the point of UNRWA. It was a humanitarian thing to specifically not talk about politics, and yet you're talking about durable solutions. Does that mean a right of return? I never understood that. He suggested it did.
Well, I think we need to have a kind of full session on UNRWA to get into this a lot more. But the idea is moving away from a purely technical, like the main services in terms of the health and education, to providing what's called this kind of durable solutions. And I think this gives it a de facto more political role, in the kind of expanded understanding of what political means. But I'm saying, apart from this question of durable solution, there is a store of, and has long been, a store of international responsibility to deal with the problem of Palestine refugees and their inherent right of return. If you were to defund and then therefore end up destroying UNRWA, then it's not that the Palestinian right of return disappears, because that's inherent in each of these individuals. But symbolically, institutionally, the mechanism that most represents these people, these refugees, disappears. And so, of course, that's a huge hit. So we can talk about, no, everybody has the right to do this or do that, but you need the institutions, and this is a very, very important institution in that sense, in that kind of political sense. So yeah, I think that to me explains the targeting, the kind of the vehemence, this kind of anger, this kind of maliciousness that goes into the attack on UNRWA, and this collective kind of European and other donors that got sucked into this, collaborating in a sense on this, trying to destroy UNRWA, which I find
in the midst of a famine and genocide.
In the midst of a famine and genocide. And
Yeah.
something which I think these countries, and I think Chris mentioned it, should be held to account. And I think it's very important to hold them to account. How? It's not clear, because you need the UN and the UN Secretariat and the UN member states to conduct these kinds of commissions. But in principle, these should be done. And I think what we were discussing and what Chris was alluding to is that the battle to come will be in many of these states themselves, within the court system and the legal systems in each of these countries, where let's say dual Israeli citizens, let's say French Israelis, will be prosecuted in France for being part of this. Things like this. I think this is what's going to happen over the coming months and years, hopefully. So
thank you. Thanks. I mean, thank you, Karim, actually, for organizing this. It was a good session, good debate.
Great. So with that, I'll say goodbye to you guys. Have a good time in California. See you soon.
See you soon, Karim. See you soon, Sadi.
Bye. Bye.